Okay. Welcome to Georgia Elections Guide 2024, Episode 7. Today, we will discuss everything about Election Day and post-election fallout. We don't have each single sort of issue to discuss, but we will all discuss everything together because a lot of things have happened. And I think it's important to have this episode continue because we're thinking about doing it before elections, but I think the post-election has become even more turbulent that we should discuss it. So let's start with election day. Who would like to begin? The ones who voted
Yeah.
actually went to, why don't you describe the vibe, the ones who did vote and go to the polls?
I can begin actually. I'm a Georgian citizen, based in Georgia and voted actually again and again. So the most interesting thing is that the election day was quite normal. It was not something really chaotic or anything more violent because I actually expected it to be more tense, considering the pre-election tension between the opposition and the ruling party of the Georgian Dream. But when I went to the voting booth, everything was very, organized, quiet, and everyone was quite friendly. And the biggest surprise for me was actually the results. And the results, I mean that the Georgian Dream actually won more than 50% of the vote. And that was really surprising for me because I thought they would win around 45%. But then again, the exit polls that were done by the opposition showed that Georgian Dream had around 41 to 43% of the vote. And when it's done by the opposition, it means that Georgian Dream would have had more than that, of course, considering also the previous years. Like, for example, Edison Research, that is sort of a quite ambiguous polling organization that has been polling in Latin America and always giving higher polling numbers to the pro-American and pro-US imperialist forces. They have shown that the governing party would have gotten around 41%, 40.9%. And considering the previous elections and the elections of 2012, when Edison Research actually gave them 35% and Georgian Dream got 55%. And it happened during Saakashvili's regime, and Saakashvili was in power. Therefore, since then, Edison Research has been very much, the reputation has been tarnished. And when Edison Research is saying that the party that is not very much keen to be a pro-Russian, pro-US puppet actually would get around 40%, then you have to calculate plus or minus 8 to 12%. And therefore, I thought that, wow, Georgian Dream will be getting more than 50%. And what we see, the result is that the combined opposition, the four parties that were able to go over the 5% threshold, all of these four parties have gotten around 37%. And Georgian Dream got 53.9%. So Georgian Dream got around 54%, and the second largest, second most popular party got 11%. That's a huge difference. And when the polls were announced, when the exit polls were announced, Salome Zurabishvili, the current president, that is French-born Georgian nationalist emigre, has celebrated that Georgian Dream would have gotten only 40 to 45%, and the opposition altogether got more than 50%, but that proved to be wrong. And at the same time, the pro-government pollster showed it was more than 56%. However, at the end of the day, we got 54%, and it was first time that the electoral machines and electoral voting was used in our country. And before the elections, the opposition was saying that please go and vote. It is impossible for the government to forge the elections. But after the election results were announced, they said that there was some forging and rigging involved, and we can discuss about that later, and Sopo will give
Yeah,
more details about that.
yeah, let me talk about that. And
Yeah, but I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm
can we
just gonna have
actually
to.
first have Georgi talk about, you're giving like a
Yeah,
lot
but
of
can I finish? Can I finish? Can I finish what I was saying?
and
I will
can we
finish
talk
it in.
about the voting process in the rural areas with Georgi, and then we can open it up for a larger discussion. So I kind of like I wanted your like input, but I want
Okay, and I will just say that I voted in the city center, Tbilisi city center. That's all.
okay, Gio, why don't you talk about
Okay, so
your experience voting?
yeah, for because I'm not registered in Tbilisi, I had to go back to my rural voting district. So I had to go back to where I came from, as Tbilisi residents would say. The roads were congested for like a couple of days in a row, like 3 or 4 days. The roads were completely congested. So the actual like a road trip to my house took like 2 or 3 hours longer than it usually would have taken. So I got there quite late. I was actually I was like one of the last voters who voted at my district, because at that point, like, whole village had already, at least almost all of the residents in the village have voted already. So when I got there, I encountered a bit of drama there. I met a lot of my relatives who I haven't seen for a while. They were, hugging me, kissing me, telling me how much I've grown, over the years that I haven't been there, and all that kind of stuff. And a couple of my relatives, escorted me to the room, and then they waved at me, and then I voted. The voting process was actually quite smooth. Nothing happened there. I voted. I left the building, and I saw that one of the observers who was appointed by the NGO in Tbilisi. I don't know which NGO. My neighbors told me that she was a girl appointed by an NGO. She was screaming at my relative, who is an actively, openly pro Georgian Dream voter. She was screaming at her because of me, apparently, that she hugged me. The NGO girl took it as a manipulation of voting. She said that my relative was trying to manipulate me into voting for Georgian Dream simply because she hugged me and she escorted me to the door. Even though there are lots of other people, like lots of my relatives, like my father and other relatives and neighbors, who are openly, uh, pro opposition, and they were also there with me, she didn't target them at all. She just targeted one person who she knew exactly for sure that she voted for GD. And this caused a big scandal, and lots of screaming for like 5 minutes, 6 minutes, almost like 10 minutes even. And yeah, and then I saw that girl, the observer girl. She like separated herself from others, and she was like talking on the phone for a while. And I think that she was talking to her supervisor, reporting this back. So this kind of made me think that, because they started reporting a lot of stuff, like a lot of violations. If this can be considered a violation, my relative just hugging me, saying how much I've grown, and escorting me to the door, then I can imagine what kind of other stuffs can be reported as violations as well. And then all of these things can accumulate and then give a wrong picture of elections, because this is certainly not by any law a violation. I'm 100% sure that she's not from the rural area. She's not local. I'm 100% sure that she's from Tbilisi, because she didn't understand the dynamics. Now, I don't know how people in Tbilisi vote, because both of the times I voted in my village. So the voting building, it's usually a school with a huge yard. So people actually get together there. So people being there, like next to the village, like voting building, usually the school, is quite normal. It's accepted. People go there during the election days. They stand there. They talk to each other. They converse about politics. They converse about what they think the election results will be. My father was talking to other opposition voters, or even like pro-government voters. And the thing is that what I noticed is that, for example, my father, openly voted for opposition, and my relative openly voted for Georgian Dream. But they were hugging each other, they were laughing, they were making like sarcastic jokes at each other, but it was in good faith. But then this like woman came out, and she started screaming at her, like targeting one person out of like five, including me. And it felt like she was trying to divide the population in the village, people who know each other for like years and years and years. And this made me think that, do we actually have polarization in Georgia, or like from inside, or is polarization literally imported from outside, by outside forces? So yeah, that really was like quite shocking because nothing like that happened 4 years ago when I voted last time. But yeah, other than that, I mean, the voting process went smoothly, and the rest we can talk about later.
Can I ask you a question? So one of the charges is that somehow rural voters showed up more pro-Georgian Green also at the end of voting day. If I understand correctly, a lot of people were on buses going back to the villages, and everybody was posting this, right? That like, oh look, all day there was traffic, and so I know you were supposed to leave the day before, but because there was so much traffic, you went that day. So buses showing up full of people to vote towards the end. They're trying to say this is like a deviation shows some kind of rigging. But your experience tells me that's probably what happened because of all the traffic and people got there late.
Yeah, this is actually, I saw that post like immediately, like once it was posted, like it didn't even have like many likes when I saw that. And that was literally my first thought is that, there's a whole graph that, Georgian Dream got a lot of the votes at the end of the day, especially in the rural areas. In Tbilisi, for example, the voting process like died down at the end of the day, but in the rural areas, it kind of, plateaued at some point and then died out like later during at night. And that for me made perfect sense because like Tbilisi residents are registered in, like most of them are registered in Tbilisi, and their voting blocks are like 5 minutes walk away from them. For me, for example, and for a lot of people who are registered in the rural area, we had to take a bus, we had to take a car or something like that. For example, even when there's no traffic, it takes like 5 hours to get to my village, and 5 hours is like recent thing when they built like a new highway. It used to be like 6 hours, but now that the roads were congested, it took us like 7 hours at least. I think at least 7 hours. So, and we left at like 10 a.m. I think. So yeah, and I know like I could look back and I could see like a lot of cars coming, after us. So this road was extremely congested, and a lot of people arrived at the voting blocks very late. Um, so I think this thing is that, oh, like rural voters usually vote for GD, and rural voters arrived very late at their own voting blocks. So this makes perfect sense that their like Georgian Dreams voting graph would spike at some point later in the day because again we took like 7, 8, some even 10 hours to get to their voting block. So yeah, that makes perfect sense in my opinion. But yeah, I can get why, if like for example, like Tbilisi residents who are usually extremely ignorant about how residents in regions live, or like foreigners who don't really understand. For example, like one of my friends told me, "Oh, you actually go to the place to vote, like we mail in or and stuff like that." They don't understand how it works here, but here you have to vote where you're registered, and sometimes you're registered like 7 hours away from where you actually live.
Thank you so much for that. I feel like if you hadn't gone back to vote, I don't know if we would have known like how that works, like from a personal experience. So it's fascinating for me. Somebody who has never voted and will never vote probably. Um, so um now what do you think afterwards? Maybe Rezi, since you already started talking about this, um, what do you think happened? Um, why do you think Georgian Dream got such a high percentage of votes? Since you were also thinking they would get less.
Yeah, I was thinking that Georgian Dream would get, of course, the parliamentary majority, and I would also think that Georgian Dream would have gotten the largest share of the votes. But I also, some of my many acquaintances did not really think that it would be this high, that would be like 54%. Of course, we would think that Georgian Dream would get plurality of the votes. And we saw that in almost all the districts in our country, Georgian Dream got more than 40%. Even in Tbilisi, the combined opposition was not able to have plurality of the votes. It was Georgian Dream, and I know Georgi has done a really good calculations about that, and maybe he can talk about it later, how Tbilisi has voted, because there's a false information circulating how actually the opposition has won in Tbilisi, but that is actually very wrong, and Georgi can elaborate on that later. However, for example, in my case, my grandparents, who have not voted since 2018 and did not vote in 2020, didn't vote in 2021, went out and voted this year. And I think that the biggest issue that made the Georgian Dream voters to have such a large turnout in voting was the Ukraine and the war thing. And I will explain why. Considering the fact that our position and the Georgian Dream didn't really talk about the economy, and we have covered the major issues of the campaigns. It was all about the geopolitics and foreign politics. We saw that opposition did always underline how important it is to be aligned with the West, and how some of the opposition parties and some of the opposition NGOs that were supporting the oppositions have openly vouched for Ukraine and saying that Ukraine is winning. And of course, Georgian population is not foolish to not see through this mirage and these lies. And we see that Ukraine is basically being defeated at the battlefield, and we see millions of refugees. We see cities being destroyed. We see people fleeing from the country. We see how young men are forcibly taken to serve in the army. And also, Georgia has experienced the similar situation in 2008, when we were defeated by the Russians, and when the United States and the West, the only help and support that they provided actually was sending Georgians drinking water. And it really shows that they know nothing about our country, they know nothing about our region, because Georgia actually does not need drinking water. Georgia was one of the leading mineral water countries within the Soviet bloc. And I'm not saying the Soviet Union, but I'm also saying the socialist bloc in the world. Therefore, Georgians were very much disenfranchised by the Western promises, because we have been told that they are waiting for us to go become the members of the NATO, of the European Union. But at the end of the day, when it comes to war, when it comes to the crucial moments, the help never arrives, and we are the ones that are being slaughtered and killed in the name of the West, in the name of the democracy. And we see, and Georgians in the street that I meet often say that the West is fighting the Russians till the last Ukrainian, and we actually do not want that. And also, it was very important to remember the interview with Bidzina Ivanishvili, when he said that the former Prime Minister, Georgian Dream Prime Minister Gharibashvili, was told by a high-ranking official from the Western countries that Georgia should open a second front against Russia, and we should fight for 3 or 2 days, and we are 3 million people, and probably not all of us will die. And this kind of rhetoric and the Georgian Dream's campaign for peace, and showing these images that were very much unpopular among the liberals, showing the contrasting images of Georgia in peace and Ukraine in war, and showing the destruction, it actually worked a lot. Because I know, for example, my stepfather, who's a staunch supporter of the opposition, he himself opened up to me and told me that the war thing was the deciding moment that he actually voted for the governmental party of Georgian Dream. And the mobilization of the Georgian Dream and generally the turnout was the second highest since the 2012 crucial elections, when Saakashvili's regime was defeated. It was 61% in 2012 when the turnout, and now it was around 57%. That is huge. That's a really high number. And people were not actually voting for Georgian Dream. I observe, and my observations and my contacts, I can tell you that people actually voted for peace. The people actually voted against the opposition, but did not really offer anything against the war, and actually was feeding in the Georgian Dream's campaign of peace. And people were afraid because they see there's no real promises, there's no economic promises. The European Union membership is a bullshit from now, they think. And the only thing that actually is stopping the war at this moment and us not becoming a mincemeat, it's basically Georgian Dream. And I think that was the biggest and the most prominent issue that made people to actually vote for the Georgian Dream at this moment. Maybe any other ideas?
Okay. I have some thoughts as well. Brian, do you also want to speak about this? Why do you think Georgian Dream could actually get 54% without rigging it?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing really quick. I think the most interesting outcome of this election has been the response that it was impossible that Georgian Dream could have actually seen an increase in their voter base. And if you look at like the way that a lot of people are arguing or contesting the results of the election, they say things like, well, given the fact that there have been these movements all year, given the fact that there were competing exit polls, one of which said that Georgian Dream was going to get X and then it got Y, it's impossible that there's a way that they could have seen an increase in their voter base. And what's interesting about this is that it's a complete avoidance of all the factors that could have actually led to their voter increase in the rural area. Of us have been bringing up for a long time.
Brian, your internet is breaking.
Why would voters are
your internet went out?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, my internet's not good today. I'm using, okay. I'll try one more time. I'll just say that it's a very simple point. I just wanted to say that there's a lot of reasons why Georgian voters would have decided that they wanted to vote for Georgian Dream in this election, even if they were, say, not the biggest fans of Georgian Dream. But the fact of the matter was that, unfortunately, the issue, there's a number of issues, right? One of them is that even though it's unequally distributed, Georgia has seen economic growth. That's usually a sign of strength for incumbent parties around the world. Like in the United States, Georgia doesn't matter. That's a fact. Second thing is that the war and peace issue, as everybody's already brought up, was very important in this campaign. And the fact that Georgian Dream presented itself as being the only force in the society capable of managing the Russia issue, and in fact improving it while still getting EU candidacy status only a year ago, basically presented to most of the society that they were the force that had sort of like the balanced initiative under control. And I think it's important to remember, everybody should take into consideration that that's a goal of every single post-Soviet Georgian government, and that previous post-Soviet Georgian governments have failed to do. So I think in the eyes of many people, and I'd also say one other thing that has to be interrogated further, which is that we know, and people have talked about, that NGOs and kind of the liberal society in Tbilisi especially have a very large distance from the average Georgians who are living in the regions, right? Georgians living in the regions don't really have connections with nonprofit organizations, kind of pro-West institutions. They haven't seen a lot of benefits from deep into EU ties. And so when you had these mass protests and mobilizations and the consolidation of the opposition around literally the defense of NGOs as the democracy of Georgia, I think it alienated parts of the population who could not buy into the rhetoric that said, like, there's a huge clampdown on Georgian democracy or this kind of negative path that society is going. In fact, I think they interpret it more as like, no. What's going away from us is the opposition and some of these pro-Western, or I should say everybody's pro-Western, but some of the kind of like mobilizations to like defend the NGOs actually didn't work in the favor of like getting the majority of the society who are already distanced from that kind of political and institutional political world on their side. So I think there's a lot of reasons, which we can discuss further.
Yeah, I think for me, my reasons are a few. Like, one main thing is that the world in 2020 and the world in 2024 is incredibly different, you know? So many radical changes have happened that it's obvious why people would not be the same kind of people that they were in 2020, right? First, the pandemic. The pandemic also opened up because of a lot of mishandling all over the world, much more suspicion towards like what institutions were even saying, trusting authorities from the EU or US. Second, war. War has definitely been very important parts. Third, giving some of the things that Georgian voters have been wanting from Georgian Dream, the sort of more, they like the more aggressive rhetoric against UNM, anti-LGBT law, and the NGO law. Fourth, culture wars becoming more and more sort of escalating. There's now like 1 million videos and things and people's posts mocking rural voters and people over 50, which has become a huge problem. I have seen personally people who were thinking a very different way 2 years ago completely change after they have seen this. Like I said earlier, they have never seen Western governments be like bad guys here. First time they're seeing like this kind of intervention, not understanding Georgian context, mocking Georgian choices. So I think that was like a huge sort of turnaround, like in people's brains. And I think, if there's nobody likes the opposition, like it's very rare to find anybody who likes it. And a lot of people also don't like Georgian Dream. But if you were talking about trust, which often the liberal democracy, people use trust, right? The only level of trust exists in one thing here. Though people do not like Georgian Dream who voted for them, and they may have been upset not getting the factories or whatever they were promised, and more prosperity quicker. And despite the fact that actually there is increase in economic activity and things are getting better now on a macro level, not sure about micro level. One thing everyone names is that Georgian Dream, they trust the Georgian Dream in one thing only, and that's to keep peace. That's something that's indisputable. So nothing about the opposition has that level of trust. And they also trust the church. That's also really high. I mean, Georgians trust the church, they trust the police. This is what polls show. I mean, as much as we can take all of that into account. So I do think the last 4 years have been revolutionary in some ways. So I do think they could have increased their votes. Now, the biggest thing, I think, what alarmed the opposition was losing, and also Georgian Dream doing better than expected, and then better than their exit polls that they commissioned with their people, and supposedly what other exit polls had shown earlier in other elections. But we also have to take into account this election was the first fully proportional election. Majoritarians were running before. Majoritarian looked at their voting patterns, and especially in the regions, they have like 60% victories, We didn't know how that was going to be translated into fully proportional either. And this also, we didn't realize how, another part I forgot to name, is that the opposition did not run at all in the regions. They did not do anything there, did not campaign. So when you have, before with majoritarians, you were kind of forced to have a local political person to at least campaign there. But they didn't even have that this year because of the majoritarian being no longer there. So that means, to me, could be, right, that because they didn't even care to have anyone local campaigning, that set them back again, even worse. And we didn't know how much the already very high majoritarian takeaways that Georgian Dream was getting was going to affect the proportional. For me, there's a lot of reasons you can say that Georgian Dream could have increased their votes, and actually was not surprised over 50%. I did believe they were going to get over 50%. However, Now, maybe we could talk about what happened right afterwards. So, Georgian Dream opposition both celebrate with the exit polls because they're all deferring to different exit polls.
Can I say like one extra thing? Why I think, yeah. So why I think this is an important thing is that why I think that Georgian Dream won, and I've been saying that they will win. I completely also with Soko expected that they would win over 55%, over 50%. I mean, I also like documented it in my university. Is that Georgian Dream is well, not the only, but only one who like passed the threshold, is the only party that found its actual voting base. Like they are the ones who went out in Georgia. They started, polling, whatever, and they're like, okay, this is our voting base, and we're going to work on them like completely. So their voting base is slightly older, slightly more conservative people. So they were like, okay, this is our major, whatever electorate, and we're going to dedicate like 90% of our energy on them to get their votes, and rest of 10% of the energy on other people, to get some of the other people as well. Meanwhile, the opposition didn't have the voting base. They didn't actually pick like any group that they would like capture with their hands, and that they'll rely on. The one thing that they had was like younger people, like Gen Z, that they were always pushing. But first of all, that's kind of unreliable because many of the Gen Zs don't even have a right to vote yet because they're not 18. Second of all, it's like imagine like 4 parties all having Gen Z as their whatever like voting target. So they couldn't organize it well. So these like Gen Z votes, they started distributing amongst 4 parties. So that's why none of the parties could get even 20%. Like as Revas said, like second biggest party got 11% of the vote. That's exactly why, because those Gen Z votes were redistributed amongst 4 parties, and like there are not that many Gen Z in Georgia, to get them to 50%. Meanwhile, Georgian Dream targeted a very specific, but very like every second or third person in Georgia is probably slightly on the older side and slightly on the conservative side. That's very smart. And Georgian Dream is the only party in modern history of Georgia that started going outside of Tbilisi, from town to village, organizing conferences on specific legislation. Those legislations that, for example, 4 of us probably don't even agree with, like, for example, like family law legislation. I know for a fact that they went to Kutaisi, they went to like other like regional centers, and they started organizing conferences, asking people what they think, asking people what kind of amendments they want. They probably didn't even consider those amendments, but it doesn't really matter if you consider it or not. People love the fact that the party asks them what they want to do. The only party from the opposition that did that is Girchi, which could not pass the 5% vote. So yeah, that's why they won.
The opposition told them that voting for Girchi was a wasted vote.
Yeah, it was a wasted vote.
Get Girchi not elected because they wanted people who signed on to the charter and would get over 5%, and so they also screwed them.
One more important thing is that I would just add that people really need to understand that Georgian Dream got 49, almost 50% in the previous election. And people saying that Georgian Dream was losing their base was because that the Georgian Dream voters were disenfranchised, because Georgian Dream was not strict enough against the opposition, against the West, as Sopot just mentioned. And these people were now seeing a prospect that the European Union and the United States have officially supported the UNM, said that people realized that they needed to vote for Georgian Dream again in order for the United States and the European Union not to give legitimacy to the opposition, and opposition to come back to power. And many people who actually used to vote for the more conservative party, the Alliance of the Patriots, that got around 4 to 5%, most of those votes came to Georgian Dream. These people went and voted for Georgian Dream. I know several people who actually used to be staunch supporters of Alliance of the Patriots, who used to be disenfranchised by Georgian Dream because Georgian Dream decided not to actually punish the Saakashvili's regime And that's why now Bidzina Ivanishvili promised that they would actually start punishing Saakashvili's regime. These people all went back and voted for Georgian Dream, and that's really important to consider. And Georgian Dream got almost the same amount of the vote share as they did in 2012, and that happened under Saakashvili's administration, where the Central Electoral Committee was actually under Saakashvili, and several polling stations were actually been revoked because of the meddling of Saakashvili. And Georgian Dream got around 55%. That translates around 1.2 million votes. That is 100,000 votes less, 100,000 votes more actually than the Georgian Dream Party received in 2024. And that's really important to consider.
I just want to say one thing really quick. A friend of ours, Becca Natslishvili, was on a talk yesterday, a roundtable discussion about the elections, and he said something very, very good, which was Georgia a long time ago ceded its sovereignty to determine the legitimacy of its own elections. And I thought that this was like such a good point, because what's going on right now is that, yes, there's this debate happening between the opposition and the state on whether the elections are legitimate. But fundamentally, at the core of the issue, similar to other issues about whether Georgia has the right to institute laws that the EU doesn't like, there's actually a fight happening against the sovereignty and legitimacy of a state institution, the Central Election Committee. This is like a very interesting aspect of the dynamic where the Central Election Committee is actually trying to assert the fact that it has the right to determine whether or not the elections were held well or not. And people are trying to actually like kind of take that from it. So you have to understand that there's also the state building aspect. And I also want to just mention one other thing that go off something Sopo said earlier, which is that we're living in this period where the United States, the European Union have become the political aggressors, and the other states are not. And I think that people do implicitly understand that if the goal is to have a sovereign state that has a politically sovereign state to the degree possible, that ensures peace and some kind of stability, that in this election, whether you like it or not, there's not been sort of like aggressive posturing from the Russian side or from any other state. There's only been political lambasting of the ruling party for months because of a disagreement between the ruling party and Brussels. And I mean, there's many other factors, obviously, we can go into, we've discussed them. But I think it's really important to keep this factor in mind of what is actually the perception of the situation by most Georgian citizens. And the last point is that there's a very big problem going on, that the EU and the United States are doubling down an information war, where they're saying that if you criticize the West, that this is disinformation, and that therefore these voters in Georgia who may want to be, maybe they even want to be in the European Union, but have a critical posture towards some of the policies and the posture of Brussels, are actually just wrapped into this narrative. They're illegitimate. Those critiques are not right. They're the product of disinformation. They've been duped. It's a Russian special operation. So this is a huge problem, that even the West reinforces this idea that the voters who would have supported Georgian Dream would have no logical reason to, right? Because of the fact that they're in this fight with the West right now. And I think that this is a huge problem.
Yeah. Okay. So what happened after Georgian Dream was winning? And this was interesting because the president, who had just congratulated everyone, Georgia and democracy and Europeanity, her own words. She made up a word about how we're Europeanity. You showed that. And so, because she was like, oh, we won. And then once Georgian Dream actually was winning in real counts, she went silent. There was like nothing that was shown on Twitter anymore, kind of like silence. And then the next day, the OSCE, the mission, the international observers had a press conference, so we're all waiting for them to say what the elections were like. And so we watched this press conference. And so imagine all the people that went to this press conference, like most of them came here very much biased against Georgian Dream. Like they don't like Georgian Dream. Their own governments have, and their governments even themselves have made statements condemning Georgian Dream's backsliding, you know. So already very much biased against Georgian Dream. Most of the report focuses on all this pre-election polarization and condemns the NGO transparency bill that requires them to disclose foreign funding. So very much focused on that, and media freedoms and so on. Our media is very free, but there's all these like attempts to claim that media is somehow under attack in Georgia and like going down in rankings. And this is just so incredibly biased, this idea, because like 90% of media is owned by opposition and people can say whatever they want. But okay, so a handful of examples, and even some of them are not even viable. But okay, so they're trying to claim that this and this were happening, and then Georgian Dream had administrative advantage. That means generally in every single election in every country, the incumbents, like who are in power, always have an advantage over the opposition. That's just like true. So they focused a lot, made a lot of kind of political like statements, but at the end of the day, they couldn't say it was rigged. They said it was administered well. They tried, when there was journalists asking them directly in like 3 different ways, like, was it rigged? Was it rigged? They were like, we can't say that. We can only assess. It's not black and white. We can't just say that, you know, like they had, you know, problems, but like, you know, and then somebody said, well, can you compare to the previous election or other countries? They're like, whoa, wait, we don't do that. We only compare on the merits of this election. We can't compare it was better or worse like last election. Because I think they would probably get a picture that they don't like. And so when asked, we're like, how many of this ballot stuffing, vote buying, you know, what was it like? And they were like, out of, I think it was like 1,600 or something observations, well over 1,000 observations, sort of these like detailed reports, a handful was detected of double voting, which they stopped. And as far as vote buying, they said they didn't see any of that, but they noted it because someone else told them. So in their notes, if I go and tell them whatever it is that I think, and if I'm some NGO that's like credible to them, they will write it down. They will make a note of it, right? Now, what happens to these allegations and these alleged violations, we don't know in this preliminary report. So it could be that a lot of them are thrown out. But creating a sense of massive violations leads to, you know, saying, oh, there's massive violations observed, but not a verdict on it. So when I actually looked at the report and looked at the, you know, the details, it was like, I think, as far as ink, which has become a huge now, like a problem, this is what they're running with. The inking was like 6%. You know, not correct sleeves was like 9%, something like, it was like these very small percentages. And they judged out of 3,000, they said 6% were not assessed positively out of 3,000, 6%. So I'm hearing all this, and I mean, I'm not an expert on election monitoring, but nothing in it that says total rigged election, like nothing. And then a few later, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing, Sopa, while you're on this topic, is that it's important to note that these election observers, like you already said, did not make this like stern claim that the elections were rigged or the elections were not rigged. But what they did do is that they came into the process of analyzing the election day results with a political message. So interestingly enough, that they were supposed to be the kind of like neutral observers, but they came in with a political message. And the political message was actually not about the voting day. The political message was about the fact that there's polarization in the country. There's been this law against NGOs that is undermining democracy. So the playing field and environment was not free and fair. But they could not make. But they did say that administratively and procedurally, the elections were held well, and that there was free competition between the political parties. And so I think, and others have said this too, I'm just repeating what others have observed, that I think what this did was that then now you have a war between various political forces who are trying to take the statements of the OSCE and OCDIHR and use them for their own, what reading in it, what they want to see, right? Because none of the Western powers and none of the observers would say directly that the election was rigged, right? So in some sense, it makes sense now that on the one hand, you have Dream, which is saying like, look, nobody said it was rigged. They even praised it. Yes, there were irregularities, but that's okay. And then, of course, you have the opposition, and you have even the US, you have EU member states, but not all, saying, no, they said it was rigged and not fair. Therefore, we have to look into the irregularities of the election, and therefore the election wasn't properly held. And so this is a problem.
And when they were asked, like, do you think this election is a step forward to more democracy or less? They mostly focus on the pre-election, the polarization around the laws. So, of course, if you focus more on these huge protests and the laws that EU has condemned in hundreds of ways, US has sanctioned, Georgian government. Of course, if you take only this, that supposedly it's backward, right? It's a decline. So then afterwards, so I'm expecting, even though this wasn't like a great press conference, I think they did a really bad job of being neutral and actually respecting. But then again, these missions are mostly political anyway. I think they wanted to say it was totally rigged, but they just didn't have enough proof. But anyway, so then the Georgian president comes out and says the elections were totally rigged, total fraudulent. The Russian takeover recognizes government is like saying that we recognize the occupation of Russia, that like Russia has entered our gates. Insane commentary. Like it was so wild that I could not believe she went that far. Then she called on a protest, and that night she went, I think it was the next day or that night, she went on 18 different Western media and gave interviews saying this is a Russian takeover, Russian interference, everything, called every single leader that she had direct contact with, because they were only talking to her for a while, not even Georgian Dream, and pretty much scared them this is like a Russian takeover to buy time so the Western countries would not recognize Georgia, and buy time so they can come up and cobble some kind of a scheme to be able to say this was a totally rigged election. So no proof really. Oh, I just heard about this theories. Oh, I heard there was, ballot stuffing or whatever. That's not enough. And when a couple of journalists, because most journalists did not press her, were like, what do you mean? Do you have proof for Russian interference? She was like, if the US doesn't have proof of Russian interference and they had interference in their elections, how can I prove it? I'm just a small country's president. Ridiculous. Like she tried to be like, well, these tens of thousands, 100,000 people came out to protest. Where are they? Where are they? I was like, yeah, they're in the vote. You understand, right? That who comes out to protest is not the entire nation, right? Like, how do you not even get this? You're the president of Georgia, and you've been a French politician, and you're playing this stupid. I mean, it's embarrassing at this point. And so then she offends the Armenian community, calls it Armenian carousel. Oh, and she's like, oh, I wasn't trying to say anything bad. It's just like they invented rigging elections this way. It's like, oh, that sounds really nice. It's a great one. Just preposterous. And then all these people defending her like xenophobic comments against Armenians. It's just another.
I think Sopa. I think you're totally right. I think it's just. I think that the Zorobashvili's immediate running to the international media was a sign, and the very existential arguments without evidence that were put forward was actually a sign of the demoralization, weakness of the opposition. Because it was like they went straight to the most radical arguments and the most desperate arguments. And now, obviously, after a few days,
that would work, Brian, because this Russia stuff is the only thing you could just say terror Russia, and that's it. That's
exactly. Totally agree. I totally agree with you. I totally agree. That's my point.
At the end of the day, they should understand that this Russian fear-mongering does not really work, because if it worked, the Georgian population would have voted in favor of the opposition, actually. And what we saw at the end...
That was for the international. That's the difference, though.
Exactly. That was for the international community, because even the opposition voters, they themselves thought the election was not rigged, and they were sad, and they were very much disenfranchised, seeing how desperate the opposition was. And we could have seen celebrities that were supporters of the opposition actually saying that I would never come to your marches again because the marches are pointless and you could not really offer anything to the people. At the end of the day, now you're trying to somehow get the attention of the West, but you're so desperate that you don't even have evidence. Some of the opposition parties, like Girchi, who was not able to actually cross the 5% threshold, said the elections were not rigged, and they recognized it, and they said that it was their own fault that they could not actually mobilize and they could not get the votes because they were not there. Maybe it was their own fault, their policies did not work, And this kind of thing, really, some of the opposition did that, but Zurabishvili and Zurabishvili's role was very much destructive. It was trying to get more polarization. And the thing is that these people don't really understand that Facebook and social media likes and bullying does not automatically translate into votes. And that is also a problem for the Georgian liberal bubble, because they think they can bully people and these people are going to vote for them. I actually also know a member, I'm not going to disclose her name, of the NGO that actually voted for the Georgian Dream, she told me, because she was afraid of the war. But she could not really say that to her colleagues because she would have been automatically ostracized. These people on the internet, on social media, trying to cancel the people who do not agree with them, especially the liberals who do not agree with the opposition. And many people just did not express their opinions openly, especially on Facebook, that is like a liberal bubble. And they just went and they've exercised their constitutional right and they voted not for the opposition. And it was very clear. And this idea that social media would automatically translate into support at the voting booth, that proved once again to be wrong. And once again, shows how alienated the liberals and the Madame Présidente from France is actually alienated from its own population. And now what they have is a disorganized opposition who called a rally, as Sopa mentioned, for the next day, on the 20th. The elections were on 26th, 27th was Salome's speech. And this protest was not big, from my experience, because they could have actually had much bigger, larger protest. And, there was no morale. The people didn't have morale and they didn't think that they were right, because if they thought that elections were rigged, much more people would have shown up. And also, it is really disrespectful and stupid to ignore 400,000 people that actually came for the GD rally, that went for the GD rally, not because of the support of the Georgian Dream, but to show the West that people who do not like the opposition and who are against the war actually very much exist. And this silent majority has actually broken the opposition. And what we have now is that opposition does not have a coherent plan. Some opposition leaders said on the third day that there was a rally, or the others said no, there was no rally. So around 30 people showed up in front of the parliament. It did not happen. And then a member of Lelo, a member of a TBC bank, leader party, who this woman, Anadolu, who portrayed herself to be a leftist, but joined a banker who actually evicted people from houses. Yesterday wrote that she's a member of the parliament on her LinkedIn profile, but at the same time publicly saying that she would not enter in the parliament and would not acknowledge it. So there's infighting. People say, some of the opposition members saying that they would not actually acknowledge the results and enter the parliament. The others are trying to distance themselves. Then they said they don't have a plan. Some of them, like Vashadze from the UNM, called a big protest in a month. The others said they would have a plan on Monday. So there's a huge disorganization. And I don't think the opposition has it actually to carry what they want. So what they do, as Sopo and Brian mentioned, they are actually pivoting to the, not international, I don't like to say international, because I've not seen Brazilian, Indian, or South African observers on it. It's like a Western elections. And as Becca has mentioned, as Brian said, we have literally, I'm kind of offended because it's Western organizations are portrayed and parading as international. And of course, it's all about politics at the end of the day. It's not about the international law. If they cared about the international law, they would have been more vocal actually about the genocide going on in the Palestine, to start from that. Sorry.
So, interesting thing, the rally, Salome's entire message was, we are now going to find evidence. We need some time and also help us. Can you imagine? Like, you call it totally rigged. You try to stop the Western recognition. Then you have a rally and you tell your rally goers that we should help me find the evidence. Like, I mean, the preposterous, like, premise of this. But Gio, what do you think? You haven't spoken about this.
Yeah, so I think there are like many interesting things that happen, like a lot of things. For first thing that I remembered when Sopo was talking about, like false, not false, but like incorrect reporting and all of that, I remembered the incident when 2 workers from Shame Movement left the organization. This was a big thing that happened, I think, either on the election day or the right after the election day. And the 2 workers said that they were pressured by the heads of the organization, or at least, their whatever supervisors, to write as many reports as they could possibly do. And, they wanted to write as many reports, to make elections look either invalid or to make Georgian Dream look worse. So they said that these 2 workers said that they didn't want to, falsify reports. They didn't want to actually, win the elections on false claims. So they left the organization because of that. This Shame Movement is really having a horrible election period. We already covered one of their drama, now another drama, on top of. Yeah. Other than that, I also, I was interested because a lot of the people were saying that, like, opposition won Tbilisi and they lost regions. And actually, like, TESO professors, some of them came out and said that, oh, these regionals decided our future, and, now we should. And one of the professors said something like, oh, and you guys criticize me for, like, differentiating people on social basis, as if, that's a good thing, and that you should actually, differentiate people, whether they're from, Tbilisi or regions. There's like a lot of anti-region and a lot of anti-old people narrative that's going on right now, which will definitely feed into the same polarization that then they'll write a report on. So that's a funny thing. So I really wanted to see, how, like, Tbilisi actually voted, and I have like a whole sheet on that. Well, the opposition, well, technically they did win. The 4 major parties together, they got, I think, around 47%. No, I'm incorrect. They got 45% of the vote. 46, let's round it up. The Georgian Dream got 42% of the vote, and the parties which could not cross the 5% threshold together, they won like 10% of the vote. The biggest one of them was Girchi, which actually in Tbilisi, Girchi crossed the 5% margin. They got like 5.3, even though they were quite disappointed with that too. And Alliance of Patriots got like 3%. So that's interesting to see that, because like they made it out to be as if, like, opposition had this overwhelming majority in Tbilisi. When in reality, if you count the parties that could not cross the 5% margin, that's not really that big, like those, main parties like not Girchi, I mean, Gakharia, Lelo, Akhali, and UNM together could only get 46% of the votes. And out of 10 districts, Georgian Dream actually won 3 districts with a full majority, which is Katsanisi, Isani, Samgori. And in Chugorati, they got like even votes, I think. Yeah, 43.2 and 43.3. Yeah, so that's like very. So the picture that they painted is like, oh, this Tbilisi is a like a hotbed for opposition and for progressive fighting and all that. It's like completely. Unfortunately, that's a complete bullshit. If we're being honest here. So yeah, that's another very interesting thing that happened. I'm mostly worried about the rhetoric that they're trying to push, and especially like a day and 2 days after the election results were published, I saw some like very alarming posts done by people who voted for opposition that were like clearly influenced by their opposition leaders. Some were saying, like, fuck my father for voting for Georgian Dream, or fuck my grandfather and whatever, like they were insulting their own parents, they were insulting their own grandparents, which I don't think is normal. They were saying stuff like, all of my friends who voted for Georgian Dream, remove me, I don't want to talk with you anymore, and I will not even say hello to you, and all that, like. And this is definitely incited from outside, from the opposition leaders, because they lied to their voters that we won and Georgian Dream stole these elections and all that. The first protest that happened is actually also quite interesting. It's also quite sad, is that not a lot of people came out. They could only cover parliament territory. And what I noticed, like outright, that happened during the protest is that UNM members would come out for this speech, and in almost all of the speeches, they would mention Mikhail Saakashvili, free Misha. And this is very alarming for a lot of the people who actually went to the protest, because many of them are not actually pro-Misha. For example, Gakharia voters. Gakharia was also part of the first protest. Gakharia took voters from Georgian Dream. He used to be, ex-Georgian Dream prime minister. And when he left the Georgian Dream, he took like some percentage of their voters with him, like 5-7%, something like that. So actually, Gakharia voters are extremely anti-Misha, extremely anti-UNM. So when you have this rally that is supposedly about, fair elections and, to protest what the government is doing, and then you come out and start talking about Misha, free Misha, free Misha, our third greatest president, Misha, whatever, then a lot of people will be disappointed with that. And the consequences of that showed up immediately. That's the funniest thing. Yesterday, now 3 opposition parties announced a protest on Monday, so no longer 4. And as I've read it on the internet, Gakharia didn't participate in organizing newest rally. He said that he'll support them and whatever, and might go to protest, but he said he explicitly said no to participate in organizing that, and he said that he'll take his own separate approach. So he took away like 7% of the voters, 7% of parliament members from the opposition. So this very fickle union, which was again extremely weak from the get-go, this Georgian charter that is made up by 4 parties. They already lost one of them, which is Gakharia party. I mean, they didn't like outright lose it so far, but they're going to lose it. I mean, it's quite obvious. If Gakharia will continue, I'll just say like one short thing is that actually what Rivaz mentioned previously is that how disillusioned the voters are with their own parties. I talked with a lot of people who voted for opposition, especially in my university. We have a lot of Gakharia voters there. And some of my classmates are actually in Gakharia youth wing. So, we talked with each other, we exchanged some ideas, and I asked him, like, what does Gakharia youth wing think? And he told me that even party youth wing could not agree on the claim that the elections were rigged. So imagine, even the party affiliated organization could not come out and officially say that the elections were rigged. In fact, he said that many in the youth wing think that the elections went fine and that Gaharia got 7% of the vote. Like, let's be realistic here. Gaharia doesn't have much money. Like, Lelo has a billionaire. Georgian Dream has a billionaire. UNM has like very loyal supporters, like 20%, whatever. Gaharia, on the other hand, he doesn't have money. He doesn't have like loyal supporters. He doesn't have anything. And he got like almost 8% of the vote. That's like the best that he could do. He got more than I expected. So a lot of his voters are extremely frustrated now that he's saying that, oh, I will not join the parliament. My friend, my classmate who's in the youth wing, he told me that youth wing, like part of the youth wing, is actually mobilizing to, you know, coerce Gaharia into joining the parliament, because they said that, you know, we voted for him to join the parliament. None of them had the delusion that he would actually win the majority and be, you know, the prime minister again. They just wanted him to be at least in the minority in the parliament. But now that he's saying that, oh, you know, I will not be part of the parliament, people are frustrated. Same with Lelo supporters, and I mean, to an extent, UNM voters too. So yeah, that's what's happening.
You know, the interesting thing is with Saakashvili being a red line, it's not just for Gaharia, for many Lelo voters as well, because they think Lelo is an alternative to UNM-GD dichotomy. And also, it will be very difficult for Coalition for Change to somehow create its own identity separate from the UNM, because most of the leaders that they're there are actually former prosecutors and attorney general and former leaders of the UNM. And so them being tied with Misha and the sort of the UNM cluster leaders that will always talk about how Misha is a political prisoner creates an identity crisis for them, the same way as European Georgia had the former breakaway party from the UNM. But at the same time, I have to mention that, yes, there is a huge turmoil and a chaos, and there's a split within the parties, especially Lelo, I can see that, and of course Gaharia. But Gio, I have to say that Gaharia was a business ombudsman, and he has a backing of a lot of businesses. Maybe he does not have a prominent billionaire like Ezerashvili supporting the Coalition for Change, and also being a sort of former member of the UNM, and not like Bidzina, but there are lots of businesses and millionaires like Kumsidze and others that actually, and others that would actually back Gaharia as an alternative. But the thing is that with Gaharia is that he could not really establish himself as an alternative from a policy perspective or a geopolitical perspective, you know? He did not really talk about or did not really confront the GD propaganda. He did not really explicitly oppose, for example, the GD laws. For example, the anti-LGBTQ law, he actually is very much conservative when it comes to the queer issue. And therefore, Gaharia is quite conservative on that. Also in geopolitics and geopolitical framing, I mean, he could not differentiate himself from other main political entities that were running, you know, so that's a problem. And yeah, I would say also the very important thing that we should not forget is the people saying that, oh, look at the diaspora vote. And that's an important thing I think we should discuss. And the results of the diaspora vote is that Georgian Dream actually lost the diaspora vote, but the diaspora vote is very much different than Moldova. If there's like around 300,000 votes in Moldova diaspora vote, our diaspora vote was around 60,000 votes. So it's smaller than, for example, I don't know, Sagarejo region in Georgia. And at the same time, we saw was the aftermath of the elections, some of the supporters of the opposition try to openly make lists of the migrants that could have voted for the Georgian Dream. So basically, they were trying to bully these people, migrants in a foreign land, because they voted for the Georgian Dream. And this is the kind of a mindset that these people that were supporters of Saakashvili that left the country now and are sort of becoming the leaders of our diaspora, for example, in the United States, or the person who has actually tortured me in prison, me personally, got a political asylum in Sweden. And Sweden basically announced that they would break off their support or break off their relations with our government. and we should consider there's Carl Bildt in the Swedish government, the far-right government, that's an open and staunch supporter of Mikhail Saakashvili. So then there's also that. And some of the Georgian diaspora members said, oh, look, in Frankfurt, the opposition won, and unfortunately, some Azeri, some Armenian guy in the regions of Georgia, they have to decide my European future. This is very xenophobic, and I don't understand how these people think they are liberal or they are tolerant when they are openly xenophobic and looking down the people who actually live in rural areas of the country.
Okay.
It's a very interesting discussion.
It's been going on for a while. So last comments, please.
Last thing I'm going to say is that on this question of Gacharia, the way I've been viewing this is that Gacharia had this idea that he was going to become neither Dream nor the national movement, right? I'm not Kotzebi, I'm not Natsebi, right? And I think he made a very, very big mistake that maybe even wasn't his fault, but he made a very big mistake when Salome Zurabashvili put forward this idea of the Georgian charter, and then Gacharia aligned with the Georgian charter. It doesn't matter what you think about Gacharia's ideas, what his strategy is. He de facto became aligned with the national movement, and he was like a junior partner essentially in what became the collective opposition that has different forces, right? Different stories. But like, because the UNM and the former UNM Achali party coalition were the dominant forces, if you voted for Gacharia, you were essentially voting for the collective opposition. And I actually think that was a political maneuver that was a huge mistake, and it probably cost him. I think Gio, you alluded to this in your comment, which is like, I think that cost him some votes because he didn't assert himself as actually an independent force. He asserted himself as being aligned with the collective opposition. And so I think now his pivot away from the post-election kind of like opposition mobilizations is him trying to at least show politically to his supporters that are still with him, and maybe future supporters, that he's actually trying to mark some kind of independent course. But let's see if he's successful. Okay, so what's our next?
No. If Gio, do you want to comment on this? Because he said Gacharia with you. And let me just like finish it up. I think we should finish up, and I'll make last comment. Gio. He said about Gacharia.
I don't know, I think.
Agree or
yeah, I talked about Gacharia like and his voters, and same thing basically for every other party. Like, I talk with people and I hear the same like complaint about every party, is that they want their elected officials to join the parliament, and that's the thing. That's why I went to the university. I thought that everybody would be, like protesting there, just like they did during the like a transparency law thing. That I remember the atmosphere that was there at the time. Like, everybody was organizing. They were making posters. They were making whatever pamphlets and all that, and they were organizing how to go to Rustaveli, take a bus, take a taxi, whatever. None of that is happening now. I went to the university after elections, and I thought that there would be like some big thing, but nothing. Like, complete silence. Like, one or two like people maybe were complaining about like election rigging, but everybody else was completely. They were not fine with the results, but they didn't challenge them. Even the ones who like were staunchly for the opposition. And I think that at least right now, generally, Georgian population believes in the election results. I mean, everybody knows that there will be some tampering, like 1%, 2%, whatever. But in the overall results, nobody really doubts that. And that's why people push for their elected officials to join the parliament, because this is like betraying your own electorate. That's how many in Georgia feel, that they were betrayed.
Yeah. And the opposition without Gacharia have called on new protests, I think on Monday, I want to say, or Tuesday. Also,
no, they did not call it for Monday. Sorry, they called in a month, and they said they would have a plan on a Monday to do.
No, didn't they?
No, they didn't. They said that they would announce their plan on Monday, But before that, Vasha called for a protest in a month. So there's also the
Sorry.
incoherence.
Okay, clarifying. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that they don't have one unified plan of how the election was rigged. That's a really important point. They have multiple competing theories that some of the theories actually ruin the other theories. Like if we take all the theories, some of them actually, make the other theory void. What they're now trying to find something winnable, they're focusing on an administrative part about ink being shown through the ballots in the back. And if somehow that was not a secret vote because the person that's helping you could see the ink. And so they're gonna try to push, and what I've noticed after their competing theories, they couldn't figure out how to do the carousel because that would take insane level of coordination to pull off, So they're looking for something, something to go after that they can hold up to say that the votes were no longer the votes should no longer be counted. And I mean, they're competing. Some will say, 34 precincts need to be annulled. Another will say, actually, 2,500 out of 3,000 need to be annulled. I mean, it's crazy. They're really just doing everything impossible and just like kind of ruining their own chances. All the sort of the Harris X poll and the Edison poll, people are releasing joint statements, and not joints separately, but saying the same thing, that statistically it's impossible for Georgian Dream to have won. I mean, there's a whole machine at this point working, and all the Western press sort of copying this, that this was totally rigged and the election should not happen. Okay, so even if, say, they establish that somehow Western governments look over the evidence and somehow they are like, yeah, okay, we have enough evidence now to say it's totally rigged. What then? Okay, like I don't think most people will believe it because they have been so sloppy and ridiculous about it, right? And what will be enough evidence for the Western observers will not be enough evidence, say, for me or many others, because we know how biased they were. So I don't see this going well for the opposition. I see them obliterating themselves, really. And Gacharia, I find, without Gacharia, the Georgian charter couldn't even pretend to be the majority opposition. So no matter what won, they would have never been able to, in any poll, been a winner. So he put them over the top, which was already ridiculous. He helped them. And there, in no other election, if all of a sudden everyone goes crazy and says, okay, we'll have another election tomorrow, Gacharia will never be able to get the numbers that they have gotten now. And Gacharia did better than all the other polls and other Georgian Dream even was suggesting they would get under 5%. So they are the biggest losers in this, in every possible way. And this shows how stupid they really, the Gacharia took the whole thing. And also, it'll be interesting to see how the liberals, they betrayed Gacharia betrays them, or they betray Gacharia, and the infighting that's going to ensue. I was listening to the Girchi people, they're the libertarians, which, shaky on some of their politics. I mean, totally disagree with their politics, but some of their analysis. And of course, they keep calling Gacharia Georgian Dream or whatever. But he's saying, if you say there's total rigging, the only option is revolution. Everything else is nothing. So it's what you're saying is, if Georgian Dream doesn't comply with your wishes, then the only way is to overthrow or start a revolution and then fail, right? And this is really the problem with all this, because there's no other recourse. And their rhetoric and everything they do is so extreme and radical for so long, they don't even leave room for ways to get out of it. So again, what will happen? Except we're the victims as usual, because people just I'm so sick of it, honestly, personally. Just want people to work on working class issues and people think the need, and work on student life being more important, more better, and better, education and freer education and so on and so on. And we can never talk about any of this. Again, it's only about the stupid elections like it matters. And what we want, like some crazy, like they literally had opposition pulling every party possible, every person that has any base to try to concoct any kind of voter base. They could the second most voted for is 10%. Like that's a joke. Nobody won anything. The opposition is a fragile coalition that doesn't even like each other, and it's just what's it called? Like a cabinet of slightly famous faces that could get some votes out for them. I mean, that's it. They are weak. They don't have
All of them have insulted each other previously.
exactly. Oh my God. Yeah, no, it was disgusting. Abisashvili and the
They were calling Salomis Rabishvili when she wanted Putin's puppet. So
Exactly.
let's start from there.
They're always using radical, like they have again nowhere else to escalate to. Like everyone's a Putin's puppet, and then they're friends with them 2 weeks later. I mean, it's like not serious at this point. Okay, and also just the shaming, like it's so annoying. Like people are just so aggressive, like everywhere they try to come at you. Put like show trials all the time. Okay, so let's just end this. There's a lot more to say, but I think we should end it. Because we have already gone on for too long, and we can do another episode just discussing more about who owns these polls. Some people ask, like, can you go deep into who actually runs these polls, what interests they represent? And unfortunately, we don't have enough time today, but we should do that, and we should be more detailed.
We also do a small section on European report on like accession, whatever they did.
Yeah. Well, because we were also told, we forgot to say, that now officially, even though they've told us this every month, that the EU accession was stopped. And now there's a report of why it was stopped. And we will discuss that again next week. Okay, bye.
Bye.